We are in Niagara Falls, New York, attending the American Ex-Prisoner of War, Department of New York Convention. Our interview this afternoon is with Mr. John Browe, who resides in Troy, New York. He was held by the Japanese during World War II as a prisoner of war, and we will be discussing his experiences. Let me just say thank you for for sharing your time with us today.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity very much.
And if you would, if you could just begin by telling me where you lived and your occupation prior to enlistment.
Lived in in Troy, New York, which is 7 miles north of Albany, in a residential section near the Emma Willard School. I've lived there since 1951. We moved there at that time because I had obtained a position with the New York State Department of Health as the director of the Bureau of Nutrition. And that became my interest because of my experiences in World War II, among other reasons.
Give me a brief outline of your military career.
Well, it really began in medical school, where I joined the medical ROTC. And I graduated from medical school in June of 1940. Went on active duty at the Harbor Defenses of Portland, Maine on July 1, 1941. I had a 2-year rotating internship in Hartford, Connecticut beginning in July 1, 1940, immediately upon graduation, but that was cut in half. And I was rather fortunate in that I had taken Vermont State boards, and one could not get the license to practice in Vermont until one had completed an internship. And mine was being cut in half, so I wrote to the board and told them that, and I received my license by return mail and said the rest of the qualifications would be fulfilled in the military, which they were. And then on July 1, I reported to Fort Williams, Maine, which is the headquarters of the Harbor Defenses, and after a short tour in the station hospital there, was assigned to Fort Leavitt, one of the islands in the harbor, Casco Bay. And then one morning, I received a call to come back to the mainland in September, and secret orders. They even locked the door and so forth, and handed me a piece of paper. It was a regular mimeograph type thing and so forth. Everything looked the same, but there were 2 words that stood out in flashing red lights: Philippine Department. And that's where I disembarked from the General Tasker H. Bliss on October 23rd, 1941, and was assigned to the Philippine Division, specifically the 12th Medical Battalion, Philippine Scouts. And I was quite happy about that because the Scouts had been heroes of mine for many, many years, and I felt rather fortunate. This Company B was a collecting company, and we evacuated the 31st Infantry. Life was rather mundane. When you got to the Philippines, you had nothing to worry about, but on the way over, that was where the war was going to come next. But everything was rather calm, except we knew the Jap fleet was just over the horizon for many days. There were Japanese planes flying over the islands at night, etc. And things were, outside of that, rather mundane until Monday morning. There it was, the 8th of December.
And how did you get news of the war starting?
From walking from where I lived to the building where the offices were, I was told on the way that the Japs hit Pearl Harbor already.
And how much did the things or activities change on the island once you received, everybody received word of Pearl Harbor?
Well, we immediately moved into the field, large undeveloped areas around Fort William McKinley, and we moved into them during the course of that day. Our first meal at noon was a field meal with the Scouts who prepared it, etc. And we were on a military footing immediately. I can remember going back to the apartment that noon. There wasn't anyone else around at all. And things were rather quiet, and We knew there were a couple of beers left in the refrigerator, so we took care of those, walked back to where we were in the field, and things were quiet until that evening when we had our first air raids.
Tell me a little bit about the circumstances and the events leading up to your becoming a prisoner of war.
Well, there were plans that had been in existence for quite some time. There was 2 or 3 different plans, and there was some discussion as to which one would be used, which is not terribly relevant to this discussion. And on the evening of December 10th, which was Wednesday evening, we proceeded from about 10 o'clock at night to Bataan. And I had not really oriented myself to Luzon. I didn't know for sure where Bataan was, even that it was a peninsula. And we eventually got to our destination, the upper part of the peninsula, probably about 9 or 10 in the morning. The interesting thing, of course, was that the Japanese had bombed Corregidor and the naval base in Manila Bay, and there was fighter planes over McKinley in the daytime, the nighttime, firing tracer bullets and so forth, but it all seemed rather remote and unreal, as though we were watching a movie. And Cavite, the naval base, was pretty well shot up on, I remember, Monday or Tuesday afternoon. It was very early. And the interesting thing, though, was that these lines of cars and trucks and buses and whatnot could proceed to Japan, and the Japanese airmen ignored us. They had a wonderful opportunity to maybe really knock us out in the first week, but they held to their bombing assignments and so forth, and didn't arrive in Manila until the latter part of December. It was interesting learning how to live in a tropical jungle. We hadn't ever before, hadn't really ever seen one, to say nothing about living in it. The Philippine Scouts have been regular Army since 1921. These are not to be confused with the Philippine Army, which was established in August of 1941. It was quite a different group of men and quite different circumstances. They were excellent fighters. They took excellent care of themselves. They knew their duties very well and so forth. And there were 3 such collecting companies, one with the 45th and one with the 57th Infantry Regiments, which were totally Philippine Scouts except for the officers, and several other units, including the 26th Cavalry. And the 3rd Regiment was the 31st Infantry, which was a regiment which had never been in the United States. It had been in Siberia, had been in Manila for a long time, and so forth. And this was actually the backbone of the land defenses.
And what was your duties?
Well, in the beginning, it was rather nice in that the company should have 4 officers, and I was the 5th one. But the senior officer was a major, and he was assigned to the Philippine Army just about the time the war broke out. So we were at our normal complement. And I was simply in charge of the ambulances, the transportation. And we did take care of people en route. We would evacuate them from the aid stations, which backed up the front line, back to the clearing station, which was the 4th unit of the medical battalion. It was called a clearing station, where they did as much surgery and treatment as they could there, and whenever anyone needed to be evacuated further, they went back to hospital number 1 or number 2 further down on the peninsula.
Tell me what went through your mind, or what it felt like when you actually became a prisoner of war.
Well, I think this is quite a jump from December to April. And about all that seems to be remembered about Bataan was that it took 4 months. MacArthur went to Australia, and there was a death march. Many other things happened. There were 76,000 military and civilians on Bataan, who had to be fed. The gasoline, everything was in very, very short supply. The retreat to Japan from the tip of Luzon, both north and south and so forth, had to be rather hurried. They could not bring supplies with them particularly. There were local laws which prevented rice moving from one province to another, etc., all of which contributed to the difficulties. So we were immediately on half rations, and I'm talking about the middle of December. And then by the middle of January, we were on about quarter rations for the rest of the time. We ate anything that walked that was not human. And it was a very depressing time because we were told help was on the way, but realistically, you know, it was impossible. We know how long it took us to sail across the Pacific, 3 weeks essentially, to a shorter time, but not in time enough. Our Air Force was totally destroyed. In fact, in my opinion, it was a worse disaster than Pearl Harbor. But not much has been heard about that because of the location was behind the lines. And that was kind of sad. The Air Force personnel became infantrymen with no training.
Now, this time, there's pretty much constant bombardment, shelling, or...
In the very beginning, yes, because a quick way to say it is that when MacArthur declared Manila an open city and the Japanese came in, and we managed all to get into the Bataan Peninsula before their northern and southern forces met. And they thought, well, here we got some guys down here, and it would be just a short mopping up operation, and they didn't even have their best troops there. And the first big battle was in Abakai. It was about 4 or 5 days long, and we were there. And held out for that long, and it was mainly the Philippine scouts that held them off. And then there was a lull in the fighting from then until early April. There was desultory. It was never really a very safe place to be. You never knew when there would be some Japanese behind the lines or whatnot and so on. They were very good at that. And, well, for example, the coastal defenses on the Manila Bay side were things called half-tracks. And they would have to be hidden in the daytime and driven to the beach at night and back and forth and so on. For this whole unit, there was 10 gallons of gas per day. That was it. And you had to make do with very, very little. The scouts had much more to do because of the so-called Battle of the Points. The Japanese would go down the west side of the peninsula by sea and then land in there, and then we'd have to realize that they were there, and troops would have to go in and get them out. We were fortunately successful in all of these instances, but it was some of the heaviest fighting of the whole Luzon campaign. And eventually, with 10,000 Americans and Filipino soldiers in Hospital Number 2 with malaria and dysentery and starvation, and a full complement of patients in Hospital Number 1, which was a surgical hospital, in buildings that belonged to the engineers, so it was really a permanent establishment.
And how were you running on medical supplies?
They were very scarce. We ran out of prophylactic quinine, for example, and Bataan at that time, and may still be, was a hotbed of malaria. It was the worst malarial area in all of the Philippines. And normally in peacetime, when a unit was assigned there, they would all be hospitalized afterwards and treated as though they had malaria, even though it couldn't be demonstrated, because they knew they had to be infested with a parasite. And in my own instance, for example, I was never sick with malaria that I knew of, except in Japan. We'll jump ahead for a second. In December of 1944, I came down with severe chills and fever. Never having had malaria or any symptoms, we never even thought of that. And I didn't learn until 10 years ago when I met the medical officer that was in charge of Hospital Number 2, a medical hospital, told him the story. He said, "Didn't you ever think of malaria?" I said, "No." I said, "I was never treated for it. We didn't think of it at the time." And after a couple of months, the symptoms were all gone. And why, I don't know. The 10,000 was to give you some idea of there only being in the beginning, 12,000 American troops on the island. There were 10,000 Americans and Filipinos in the hospital. There were not many people fighting the battle. And there was a sizable population in the surgical hospital, including 300 Japanese prisoner patients, which may be why, when the Japanese came through, they wanted to see these people, of course. Well, incidentally, Colonel Duckworth, who was in charge of the hospital and of the medical battalion, walked down to the road on the morning of April 9th. There were tanks coming down. You could hear them firing. He walked to the road, well, probably just the distance, the depth of this hospital, with a big sheet on a bamboo pole, the orderly carrying it for him. The first tanks kept on firing and whatnot, but not at him. They just kept on going. Well, I think that would have been enough for me. I tried. But a half an hour later, another group of tanks came down, the same scenario, and he went down again. And the fourth tank stopped and opened up the top, and they sent back for their commander and so forth, and they took over. And they treated us very well. They posted guards to keep their own troops out of the area. They took their prisoners out, and we stayed there until the 3rd of July.
Do you think by having, by seeing that their soldiers were being cared for at that facility to best, possible ability under the conditions, do you think that may have had any effect on how they initially trained?
We tended to think so, but we also eventually learned that these soldiers were disgraced. They'd been captured. You're not supposed to be captured if you're Japanese. You're supposed to kill yourself. So they had no respect for us, because we were surrendered by General King. So we were dirt, as well as their own hospitalized Japanese patients were dirt. And I'm told, I didn't see this, I'm told that the commanding officer suspected some of these guys of malingering, and he just beat them up right there in the wards. And they were taken away. Yeah, we know what happened when some of our people were taken away like that, and maybe they were shot too, I don't know.
So, how old were you at the time? What was your age?
I was born on November 17th, 1915, so this puts me about 26, I think, when I was captured.
And the actual date of your capture was?
April 9th.
April 9th.
We would like to distinguish here, because there are certain things that have been said to us here on our return, and it can happen any day now, that we're sort of despised by people that don't know what happened. And they say, you put your hands up and walk like this so you could have a nice soft place to live the rest of the time. They don't know what they're talking about. You don't know what you go through before it happens, that they get you instead of you getting them. And actually, what happened was that General King, against orders, we were supposed to fight to the death. And General King saw that this was absolutely futile, that there wasn't enough food for another 24 hours, 10,000 people in the hospital, etc. He decided against orders to go forward and surrender the troops. And when he was in O'Donnell and troops came in there, he said, don't forget, you did not surrender, I surrendered you. And I think that's an important distinction. And of course, in the European theater was a different way of things happening, but it was the same idea. These were things beyond anyone's control, and you were taken. You didn't surrender. You didn't give up.
You've already referred to how the rations got scarce and more scarce,
Yep, right.
As well as medical supplies and everything else. And other folks that we've interviewed talks about the weapons, and if you had ammo, doesn't mean that it fit in that rifle.
Yeah, that's right. Sure.
And then after a period of weeks and then a period of months, things get to after a while can get to a pretty futile point.
Oh, right, right. And of course, we were the ones that took care of the guys with the rifles, so we didn't have that particular aspect to it. But we got just as hungry.
Exactly.
Well, by the way, I weighed over, the fellows asked me if I had the picture with me, and I don't. One that I found the other day, I knew it was home, but I hadn't seen it for years and years. There were two pictures taken of me outside where I lived at Fort William McKinley in November of '41. And knowing that it's only the last 3 or 4 years or 5 years recognized me, even though in a group of 3 they knew I was one of the 3. And I weighed over 200 then, and that was November. The following April, when we surrendered, I weighed 160, and in August I weighed 95. I was sick, however. I had infectious hepatitis, as did everyone. Sometimes it was fatal.
Go ahead, and then we'll jump back. But go ahead for the record here, and just like we were talking earlier.
Oh, shall I? All right.
A little synopsis of the.
So most people, if they were on the death march or otherwise, left Bataan between, let's say, the 13th or 14th, well, let's see, 14th of April, the first group came into Camp O'Donnell. That was a 60-mile tortuous walk. Many did not survive because the Japanese killed them, or they were physically unable to make it, and so they fell down and whatnot and then were killed. About 600 Americans died that way, and an estimate anywhere between 6,000 and 10,000 Filipinos. Filipinos had a better break. There were families there that could buy them out, things like that. We had no such resource. But quite a few people did escape. After the first 60 miles, it was to San Fernando. They went by train from San Fernando to Capas, which is about another 40 miles in tiny little boxcars, everybody standing up with the doors closed, tropical sun. And then they walked about 5 miles to Camp O'Donnell. And the people entered there in terms of groups of various sizes from the 14th to the 24th of June, of April. And that was the end of the death march as such. And Corregidor fell on the 6th of May, after which they brought the patients from hospital number 2, the 10,000 unit, or 10,000 patient hospital. Was simply a place in the jungle. There were no buildings, so forth. Those that couldn't be moved, they brought down to our place to try to fix up for transportation, because they'd been in casts for 2 and 3 weeks. And that was kind of grisly. And the remainders, I don't know how they took them out to Manila. And this was after the fall of Corregidor, because the Japanese didn't take the time to evacuate the hospitals particularly until the fall of Corregidor. And the guns were all around us, but at least Corregidor knew where we were, so we didn't have to worry about that. Once the great silence came upon the area, which was literally deafening, we had a hard time getting used to it. We were allowed to stay there, take care of what patients we did have until they were evacuated over a period of 2 or 3 weeks. And we simply remained there as caretakers until the first group out I was in, and on July 3rd to go to Camp O'Donnell. During this time, our commanding officer, Colonel Duckworth, whose name I should have mentioned, the man who did this turnover of the hospital, insisted we behave as garrison, that we be neat and clean, that we cut our own rations to be able to have some in reserve, and might be interested in what we had. For breakfast, 2 5-cent scoops of rice with 1 tablespoonful of wet sea ration. That was breakfast. Lunch, or 2 of the crackers and the dry ration and a cup of tea. And for supper, instead of 2 scoops of rice, we had 3. And 3 spoonfuls of wet sea ration, and that was it. So we managed to bring quite a bit of food to Camp O'Donnell, which was a good idea. We had heard all of the stories that you might imagine that filtered through, because the Japanese used prisoners for truck drivers, and they would take advantage of what they could, and they would bring us news and so forth. And we knew O'Donnell was rather grisly. So I arrived there on the 3rd of July, and on the 5th of July I was practically out cold with dysentery. The food there was rice and salt and flies. There was 1 water tap for maybe 11 or 12,000 Americans, 1 water tap. The water, of course, was running 24 hours a day, The water was used to fill up canteens, and the men that were there say they'll never forget the sound of the tinkling of the canteens, and 4 or 5 in one hand, 24 hours a day. By that time, there had been 20,000 Filipinos admitted to O'Donnell, and maybe 12 or 13,000 Americans, most of which had already been evacuated to Camp O'Donnell, Camp Cabanatuan before we got there, and the last group left on July 4th or 5th.
So how long were you at Camp O'Donnell?
Until the following October. But I also want to say that, contrast to the 20,000 Filipinos that had died by beginning July, there were 1,750 Americans were dead. And they only left 200 of the original group behind to die. We managed to save maybe 140, 150 of them. Whether they survived the whole bit, I don't know. But the final total that I'm aware of at O'Donnell was 28,000 Filipinos and 1,750 Americans in a very short time. And it's been called the Andersonville of the Pacific. A new camp commander came into O'Donnell, and he was quite a different personality. He was a full colonel. The previous commandant was a captain, and he said, I'm only interested in the number that die. I want to count every day, and that's it. And there were men who had something that was Japanese on them as they entered the camp and stood at attention and whatnot, and were searched, and these things were found, and they were just brought behind the buildings and shot. And this is the way it started. And incidentally, on the walk to the place, you could smell it miles away. And interestingly, I seem to have been the only one who put down on record that anyone is aware of the fact that there was a big yellow sign outside O'Donnell which said, "This is Camp O'Donnell, the concentration camp in the Philippines." And one of the authors said, no one else has ever mentioned that. So, but I'm sure I wasn't seeing something. We were just too preoccupied. And that was when I got sick and managed to survive that with infectious hepatitis. In fact, every prisoner had it one way or another, fatal to just, if you had some fat to eat, you couldn't eat it. That was all. Cabanatuan was quite a different story. I'll never forget walking into that with our group of 30 that night in the dark. And there were men lining the fence all the way up for maybe 300-400 yards. And everyone was calling out the name of their unit. And of course, I'd known no one when I got there, and all the people I knew were with me, so it wasn't as bad as it could have been. But it was rather dramatic. And Cabanatuan was a sizable camp. The original group, of course, went to O'Donnell, and that was worse, but then the survivors of Donnell, when they wanted to close that, moved to Cabanatuan, and that upped their death rate there quite a bit. And that was a camp of some 8,000 or 9,000. And they were constantly shipping prisoners north to Japan to work. And the day after we arrived, we were all told we were on standby to go to Davao. And none of us wanted to go anywhere else. We decided we'd just try and stay where we were. And the next day, we were told there were enough volunteers, we didn't have to consider going anywhere. So Cabanatuan was my home essentially from October of 42 until July 1 of 43, with a little side trip for 3 weeks to Cabanatuan number 3, which had housed American prisoners, but it was now vacant, where they incarcerated, captured Filipino guerrillas.
Right, tell me a little bit about how they divided up the different camps. I mean, you mentioned Cabanatuan and Cabanatuan number 3. Just kind of give me this camp setup.
Right, Charlie. This is from general knowledge and mostly hearsay, but I mean it's fairly accurate. The first camp was O'Donnell, which is a Philippine Army camp. And it really wasn't too bad, except all of this started in the rainy season. And when it rains, it does that every day, several times a day frequently. And it's torrential rain, so there's a great deal of mud. The roads were high crowned because they had to drain. They were slippery. And I mean, just for walking, there were no vehicles in the camp. And to give you some notion of the primitiveness of it, when I was told I was sick, I could be taken care of where I was in one of the 6 areas set up for Filipino hospitals, or back to the main American hospital, I had a little argument with the surgeon, and he was offering me a choice. And I said, I know I've got a temperature of 105 degrees. This is a decision, life or death. And you give me a choice? I said, I want to go the other place. I don't want you taking care of me. And this is to lead into the stretcher bearers that came down. It was coming down in torrents. They walked down this high crown road, maybe 500 yards, deep ditches on either side, all of which I was aware of. They came down with a stretcher on their head so they could keep dry. And so you know how I went up. I was on top of that stretcher over their heads so they could keep dry. And that's the last I remember for 10, 12 days. But it was very primitive. As they said, they were just interested in the numbers. The turnaround came when enough people found out how bad it was. There was an investigation by the Japanese themselves. There is a picture that's commonly seen, I've seen it many times, of bedraggled men with a pole between their shoulders carrying what's reputed to be a dead body in between them, and it's called the Death March. They didn't have time for that in the Death March, they were just left. This was the funeral march at Camp O'Donnell, up to 500 a day. This would go on all day and sometimes half the night, these dead bodies, and that was what that picture was of.
So how accurate of records are being kept as far as names or information on those who died, and who was assigned to?
They were fortunate in having an excellent person for graves registration. And the names of those that died and were buried at Camp O'Donnell are reasonably accurate, amazingly accurate from what I've been told. And Colonel Olson was the personnel officer there, appointed that after he was there about 2 or 3 days. And he was the man who had to walk up to the Japanese headquarters, a walk of probably 500 yards, every afternoon. And he never knew whether he'd come back or not, but he always did. And he has a pretty good record, and that's the subtitle of his book, O'Donnell, the Andersonville of the Pacific. And this is not a reminiscence, it's not an official history, but it's as close as one could get to it, with all the names and whatnot, the description of how they were able to identify the bodies and so on and so forth.
Were you personally familiar with the Saco Cement Cross or the O'Donnell Cross?
I was aware of it, heard about it, but when that main activity was going on, I wasn't with it at all, and then I sort of forgot about it. But I knew about it at the time, and I wish I could remember some of the detail on it that I knew then, but I just don't quite recall it.
Come April 9th, it'll be in the new museum.
Yes, I know it's going to be. I'm aware of how it was gotten out of the Philippines, etc. Because one of my friends was involved in it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you spent a good bit of time at O'Donnell, July to October, and then also at Bataan from October to July.
Right.
Just if you were to compare those two camps, is there any way to really even make a comparison as far as overall conditions?
Well, yes. Well, neither of them were very good.
They're all bad. You know?
They're all bad, right. But this was, Commander One was much less bad than O'Donnell. O'Donnell, you went there, you figured, well, maybe, well, we figured one day, I think, if the death rate continued as it was and we were there 2 months, there wouldn't be anybody left. I mean, of course, this is an impossible situation, but that's the rate at which people were dying.
Now here you're pronouncing it O'Donnell. I've heard both
Okay.
pronunciation, O'Donnell and O'Donnell.
Yeah, okay. Sure. Way back, long before any of us were alive, perhaps, there was a little, what's the word now? was a little Filipino village. And as you know, Irishmen got around. And this little village, shown on the maps, is still on the maps, is O-D-O-N-E-L, and pronounced O'Donnell. And the Philippine Army camp was in that general location, and they named it, I'm not sure whether the Filipinos named it O'Donnell or O'Donnell, but it's been called O'Donnell ever since. And then we've been mispronouncing Cabanatuan all these years. I learned the other day from watching one of the more recent videos I got a hold of. It's Cabanatuan, rather than Cabanatuan. Well, wait a minute. Cabanatuan. Yeah. So,
we do have a way of mispronouncing or changing lots of.
oh, sure, sure. And like Tokyo, for example. And after all, the French call Paris Paris, we call it Paris. I've been conducting a campaign, you ought to call Tokyo, Tokyo. It's just two syllables, to and kyo. But then we should say Paris, so I quit pushing on the Tokyo bit.
We'll call them by either one. It'll be acceptable
Yeah.
for the interview. So.
Right.
Okay. And we can come back to anything.
Okay.
We'll be fine. At this point, though, go ahead and tell me where you went after
Yes.
Cabanatuan.
Um,
You went to number 3.
I went to number 3 for 2 or 3 weeks under a Colonel Toussaint, whose younger brother I met back in 1956. He was a full colonel in the Air Force and was interested in talking with someone that knew his brother over there. Very pleasant experience for me. I don't know what it was for him. And 4 of us got detailed to Bilibid Prison. 4 doctors to go out on details as work details that were scattered around the island.
So was that were you just told to do that, or was that something that you could volunteer for, the detail?
These were Japanese orders. I don't know. They probably said they wanted 4, and the Americans picked out the 4. And I was one of the last ones into the camp, so I was one of the first ones out, which was the usual way of doing things. And that's why we're at number 3, because I've jumped ahead to where I was next. Sorry. It was a pleasant time, and it was very quiet. The Japanese didn't bother us. They didn't bother the Filipino guerrillas. It was probably as peaceful a time as we had during the whole bit. And then, of course, we got the word that this was all a mistake. We're to go back to the main camp, and another group come up. Sad part of it was that my glasses were broken before I went there, and they were repaired and sent up from Manila, and they decided to send them up to the other camp. Whereas if they'd kept them in the first camp, I would have had them. The second camp, I had the extra box, empty box. So I learned how to get along without them, which meant I was doing much more saluting and bowing than I really needed to, because you couldn't afford to make the mistake. Better to have an extra bow than one too short, because you never knew if you had the right Jap, how badly he was going to beat you up. Fortunately, it turned out to be a good strategy. They never beat me up for anything. But that's another point. And then back to Cabanatuan, in the general area of the hospital. Before that, in the beginning, there was a dysentery ward. And as a doctor, and that was pretty rugged. To give you some idea of loss of weight, I just remembered this, we cut off our pants about here for shorts and so forth. And as I said, I weighed probably around 200. At this time in spring of 43, take those pants and I'd put them around, wrap them around me, and one hip pocket would be in front of the other. That's how much weight was lost and so forth. And these guys were just skin and bones. I often comment it's too bad that somebody that could take at least a picture or 2 of this, because it was actually unbelievable. And guys only wore a G-string. You never stood behind them. They were having 30 to 45 ball movements a day, unanticipated, so forth. And when I came back from hospital number 3, or camp number 3, I was assigned to the main part of the hospital, and that was much more ordinary. Could not be very happy about it. It was very little medicine or food to help them out and so forth, but it was a little more pleasant than the dysentery area. Then late in June, we were told on July 1, the four of us would go to Bilibid as a standby. Bilibid is the old Spanish prison in Manila, which has seen things like this since it was built. And I was there maybe about a week, and I was told I would be sent to the group of 50 men who had never been in a camp. They'd been on Bataan ever since the surrender, and they were now in Caloocan, which was by the Bonifacio Monument north of Manila, which was a school, and also now a Japanese motor pool, some 10,000 vehicles, and these Americans were salvaging parts, etc. So there I went and lived July, August, September, October. It was a tough camp. The American in charge was a tough guy, and he was very careful once I got there, and after I was there a month, he said, "Have you seen anything that would lead you to testify against me in a court-martial?" I said, "No, I haven't seen or heard anything with my own eyes, but I know all about you." And he says, "You only know what you see." And I said, "That's right." And he says, "I'll be careful." He was. There's some stories about him that I have to leave for another day. But an interesting thing occurred, which in a way describes a clinical condition, but is necessary to make the story. I finally had a foreign bowel movement. This was after maybe 50, 60 days, and it injured me. And so I asked to be able to go in so I could be cauterized, get some comfort and stop bleeding. And this Japanese who was most helpful to us, his name was Smiley, and there were good ones, and he did what he could. And he was the one that brought me in. I was taken care of, and he greets me, so we go back home, and first thing he says is, "American doctor speak. You come back tomorrow to hospital to stay." I said, "No, I'm okay." He said, "I say, American doctor speak," etc. So when we go back to the camp, he runs into the headquarters and tells them the same story, and I'm in Bilibid the next day as a resident. And the next thing I knew, I was going to go to Cabanatuan the next day. I thought about that a little bit. That didn't bother me. But I wondered what would happen if the Japanese found out what this man did. He said a man was being taken into hospital to be hospitalized, and he's only there 24 hours. So I asked to see Commander Sarton, and he listened to my story, and I stayed there for 3 months, which led to I lived there as a patient for a little while, and I was in the top floor of the administrative building, very pleasant quarters, hardwood floors, etc., and got to know this Colonel Duckworth, the man who did the surrender of the hospital in Bataan. Got to know him very, very well. Meanwhile, the Japanese were making this movie on Corregidor, and they wanted 100 fairly healthy-looking prisoners and so forth to demonstrate the fall of Corregidor and whatnot, and I was assigned to go along as a medical officer. Here's a little deviation. The sergeant in charge of the guard for us decided he liked my shirt, regular Army shirt, and you had them made when you got there. I had 6 still. I had 5 in my musette bag. You never traveled except with all your belongings, both of them. And he wanted the 5 shirts. I said, "Okay, how much?" He says, "A carton of cigarettes per shirt." Well, I said, "Okay." He says, "Here's a package of cigarettes. I will take the shirts. I will give you the 5 cartons minus this package before you leave. And this you accept. You can't argue about it, but you know it's the way it's going to work out." And so he did appear. He was very pleased with the shirts and so forth. He gave me the 5 cartons of cigarettes, and he took off. The next day we went back to Manila. And the day after that, my shirt fell apart, disintegrated from the tropics. I was delighted. I really sold him a second-hand car.
And the cigarettes probably came in a lot more handy.
Oh, yes. You could barter with them. You could do a lot with them. They weren't bad. They weren't American, of course.
I mean, I guess, you do what you have to do, but I mean, how does one cope under such conditions as what you saw there at those camps that we've already discussed?
You pray a lot. You wonder if you're going to make it. You know that there are many situations in which you will be. You can't do anything about it. And you also have the knowledge that if you get into the wrong camp or the wrong hands, and these guys have their discretion. An interesting thing is that if you joined the Japanese Army yesterday and I joined it today, for our entire military career, you could beat me up and not have to answer for it. And we joined later than they did, and they felt that way, and they did, not too many, but they did chop people's head off when they got mad enough about it. And you know that this was always a possibility, or somebody could frame you, or somebody could have done something and planted evidence so it was you that did it instead of someone else. This was not a constant worry. It was in the back of your mind, but that was about all. Also, that if the war ever did end, that it would probably be touch and go at the end of it, whether we survived that. And we did know that we were all to be killed. We were not to be returned. And we also figured that was too big a job. They couldn't get rid of all of us. Somebody would bring the story out. And camps varied with the time of the kinds of people that were running it, and a whole variety of things.
Are you aware of any escape attempts that were made from those earlier camps that you were at?
Well, I roomed with a guy by the name of Warshaw from Chicago. He was a doctor, but he didn't have a commission, so he was a private for quite some time. And he roomed with me. I got to know him fairly well. He was not in the Philippine Division. I don't know for sure just where he was in Bataan. I often wondered what happened to him. And one evening in Bataan, probably in December or January, I was back there 43 or 44. There he is, large as life, healthy as all heck. And I knew he hadn't been in that camp 2 or 3 days before. And he saw me, he asked me for the money I owed him, which I was able to pay him. It was only 20 or 30 pesos, but that meant a lot then. And we got 20 pesos a month to spend in the commissary. That didn't buy you much, but it was something. And he said, well, 3 of us came in. We're going to be here 3 or 4 nights. We came in to get so-and-so. He didn't tell me the name. And we'll get him out, and we'll go back to where we are. I read about the Fasolt camp and the upper end of the Bataan Peninsula and so on and so forth. He remained free for the whole duration. He was never captured. And he didn't tell me much, of course, because it wasn't a very smart idea. How they got in and out, I don't know. But it certainly was possible. There was a standing order that for each escapee, the other 9 men in your 10-man group would be shot. I think it happened once, I'm not sure. I think it happened in Cabanatuan early in the game. There are sketches of men kneeling and being beheaded, in which are authentic happenings and so forth, although I know no details. And depending upon the camps, Nichols Field Camp was a very, very bad camp, and I think they probably killed about 40 or 50 men over 2 or 3 years that were buried within the walls of Bilibid that came from that camp. And it was unusual for that number of people to die unless something was done to them. They didn't die from disease that frequently. In fact, we figured that Cabanatuan itself, the main camp, was probably the safest place in the world to live at the moment because there was no mortality at all. Whereas when I got there in October of 42, the mortality was 30 to 45. But within 3 or 4 months and some Red Cross food and whatnot, we had an occasional day when no one died. But at the same time, they were sending people to Japan, so it's kind of hard to say just what was happening.
Do you feel like your treatment varied at all because of your, the medical background?
Oh, yes. Yes. In fact, that's why I think I was as lucky as I was. And most of the doctors were not badly treated, but Paul Ashton, for example, has a horrendous story, both at detail I went to in Kalukin, what they did to him on Bataan when he was there. I told him, Paul, why do you tell me these things? That's where I'm going. He says, I know it. I want to get you in the mood. And he was pretty sick at that point. That's why he was being replaced. But they were in a, instead of being in a jungle, this was on a, like a suburb of Manila, and it was a more civilized area, and that has an influence on how people act too, or at least it seemed to. Although I do know they beheaded a couple of Filipinos just the other side of the wall where I was. Although I didn't see it, I knew it happened.
But now you left the Philippines also. You mentioned others were sent to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead and mention the other areas that you ended up being, then we can come back and discuss them some more.
Sure. There was a call out for medical corpsmen and doctors to go to Japan. They wanted. There's some dispute about the number, and I'm probably wrong, but what I generally remember from the first impression, and that's the one I kept, was there to be a detail of some 200, of whom there would be, say, 140 medical and dental corpsmen and 50 or 60 dental officers and medical officers, to be scattered around various camps through Japan. And they screened us, they interviewed us, they did a lot of things, most of which were just window dressing.
Now, did you know that at the time then?
Yeah, we knew what it was for, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And they took many stool samples, and some of the guys substituted that for the Marine, from the stools from the Marine mascot, which is an old dog from China. And he had every bug you could think of inside him. But that didn't stop them from our introducing such bugs into Japan. Either they knew what we were doing or they didn't care, they were just going through the motions. And we were taken comfortably down to Bilibid, where we remained for 3 or 4 days, and they opened up a commissary for us, and this was a break for the patients there, because then we could buy stuff for them too. And there weren't enough mosquito nets to go around, and whereas Manila was mosquito-free before the war, it was really infested afterwards, and it was sort of miserable trying to sleep without a mosquito net, as it was in many places in the Philippines. And we were marched down to Pier 5, which is the big pier there. And on another pier, we could see the hospital ship, the Gripsholm. So when we got to that corner, somebody said, column left, but nothing happened. And we boarded the ship into the hold. And it turned out it was a ship made in Philadelphia in 1915 or 16. I did see the name there, but that I didn't remember. And I didn't know the Japanese name of it for many years, and it was the only ship that we know of that got through unscathed and undetected, because it's in nobody's history book or whatnot of the vessels that went. And just to jump ahead, on Okinawa on the way home, the Air Force guys asked me how we got to Japan, and I told them. And I said this was on the perimeter of a convoy of 45 vessels. And I gave them the exact dates, and they told me no convoy got through during those weeks. I said, you missed one, and I'm glad of it. We literally got practically tossed into the hold. The cover was battened. There was just one stairway up. There was no fresh air except what came through the hole and so forth. There was a chick sail on the side of the upper deck where if you fell through the hole, you went into the ocean. And it was very primitive. They dropped down or let down on ropes, pots of soup, and very little water. And that was about it, and that's if you had to use the facilities, you had to get up on deck. Sometimes they wouldn't let you up depending upon circumstances. So forth during the night, occasionally the ship's engines would stop, and you'd drift, and you resume the zigzagging and so forth. You were glad to hear them go again. Nothing happened at all until a day outside of Moji, which is just the northernmost city on the southern island, just below the straits of separated from Shikoku, and everybody was ordered downstairs quickly. But one Air Force officer was in the Benjo. He just stayed there and stayed there and stayed there, and he said he could peek now and then out above the door and so forth. And apparently one of our subs put some torpedoes into a Jap cruiser, and it sunk a half an hour. We were very pleased about that. There were no reprisals on us, and so on. But it was an uneventful trip compared to real hell ships. And the buddy I was with in Kalukan in that motor pool was on one of those. He ended up in Mukden, Manchuria, 65 pounds.
Yeah, I've heard some pretty
The
awesome stories.
Australian prisoners there took care of him very well.
Not to say that you had life made on your ship.
But it was a luxury compared to all of the others, And then I found a way to get in forward of the hold next to the engine room, because it got kind of cold as we went north. This was in March, and had a nice warm wall to sleep against the last 3 or 4 nights.
Good thinking.
I was just lucky in the dark. Incidentally, on this ship, where it was unmarked, of course, the forward hold was filled with Japanese women and children.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And they filled the hole below us with, we estimated, 10,000 sacks of sugar. And we were on the periphery of this convoy.
And you said Japanese women and children?
Yeah. They were brought from Takao port, where we were for a week, and where some ships were sunk by our own planes. And then we took about another 10 days to get to southern Japan. And there were women and children on it, just the same way we were. Whether there were other similar ships, I don't know, but we know about this one. And the center of the convoy were oilers, empty ones going back, or bringing them full ones, coming up from the south, bringing oil to the main islands.
So, where did you land at? What port?
It's called Moji, M-O-J-I.
Okay.
It's, there are 2 cities on either sides of the Straits of Shimonoseki, which separates Shikoku from Honshu. And you go through a tunnel. They didn't want us to see the tunnel. They closed blinds down and so forth. We couldn't figure out why. There was nothing for us to see. And we left probably at 7 o'clock, and we got to Tokyo probably about 4 in the afternoon. It was a long trip. And opposite us, seats facing either way, were 2 of the Imperial Guard who wanted to make conversation. It was a very interesting trip. They spoke excellent English. They had uniforms, like really good quality stuff and so forth. And they wanted to talk to us, and they told us about this camp, which had the fabulous black market. You could buy anything there and so forth. All of your pay was given to you and whatnot. And I said, I'm going there. That's where I went. It was populated by Australians entirely. They'd come up from Singapore in December of '42. And I was glad to know them. They were pretty good. I don't want to necessarily get off on that right now. That's getting ahead of the story. But I don't know how many. I never really counted, or if I did, I don't remember. But there were many, many camps in Japan. They were tough camps. This camp where I was at was carbon and carbides and stainless steel mills. And the Australians worked in the daytime, and another shift worked in the nighttime. And it was winter. They had snow. The snow was deep enough to be as high as the ridges on the houses, and I would say the ridge poles on the houses were at least 20 feet from the ground. So there was a path down the street in the middle. If you slid off, you were in a lot of snow, trouble, and so forth.
All right, so what camps were you in while you were in Japan?
Actually, I visited one en route to another camp, and was in, well, we got to Tokyo. We were all brought into Shinagawa Hospital, which incidentally were the headquarters for the Korean coolies that built the man-made islands in Tokyo Bay in the 1800s. That was our hospital. And we went out from there, and Noetz is on the northwest coast. You draw a straight line between Tokyo and Vladivostok. That places it exactly. And on the way there, I stopped in Niigata, which is far north, but that's the way the railroads ran, and stayed there overnight. Didn't sleep at all, and found people there that were in Cabanatuan with me, and with whom I've since been in contact, although 50 years later. And then down to Noetz, and I was the first person from outside Japan that had been in this camp. They knew nothing of the outside since before they landed there in December of '42. They were convinced the Japanese were winning the war. They had lost 60 of their 300 men in the previous 3 months, and this is one reason why I was there. Although, what can you do with nothing? However, this camp in Nagata had so much snow that the roofs caved in, and some of the barracks, killing a few prisoners. The International Red Cross found out about it, managed to get up there, and raised quite a stink about things, so the order was out from the prison camp headquarters to the various camp commandants, do not kill any more prisoners. That didn't mean by roofs caving in, but just literally not killing them, because they did that. And things improved from there on out.
So the Red Cross did know at least a little bit about what was going on in the
Yes,
camps
a
there.
little bit. But we estimate probably only 10% of all the Red Cross packages ever got to prisoners. They found warehouse after warehouse filled with them after the fall of Japan, and we know the Navy was fed on them too. But what got through was worth it, you know. But when they took and say, yes, we'll give you a Red Cross package a week, and don't give you anything else, that's really not, you're not ahead of the game.
So did your duties vary while you were in the POW camps in Japan?
Usually it was as a physician, but occasionally, as in Cabana One, where there was a surfeit of doctors because of the plans that weren't the right ones, worked in the fields that had been rice paddies but had been abandoned. They were hard as rock, lava, tiny lava granules and so forth, and growing sweet potatoes. We would, to eat, we would have the tips of the vines, they would have the sweet potatoes. They were called camotes. They were not as sweet as jams, but they were good. At least they tasted good to us when we had them.
Did you ever spend any time in any of the mines, the carbide?
No, I was only out in those buildings once or twice, and I can't recall exactly why I was there. I was with the interpreter, going somewhere else perhaps. The guys had some advantages there in that there was plenty of hot water, and if we became infested with life, you could take all the clothes out in the morning and come back all boiled, and they were nice and clean for a change and not infested. They worked the men very hard, but not as hard as in some of the coal mines built for Japanese-sized miners years ago, and mines were only about this big, and you get some Americans and Australians in there. They couldn't stand up all day, for example. They were pretty bad off.
Yeah, because you did have different types of work camps there as opposed to most of the conditions at the Philippines, was there a change in the medical problems or diseases?
Well,
medical, you know?
as far as the malnutrition was concerned, there was not much difference among any of them. It was just a matter of how little we got. Sometimes some camps got less than that. The other things were related simply to the kind of work that were involved. I don't think there was any difference in terms of malaria or dysentery or any of those other things. And some, for example, Dick Gordon, who organized the Battling Bastards of Bataan as an actual organization. We helped with the commissioning of the ship, the USS Bataan, which is the third such ship of that name, last Saturday at Pascagoula. And he was shipped from Cabana One in October of '42 and went to Mitsushima in the mountains. It was a port, well, it wasn't a port really, it was a shipping area plus mines, and he never saw any place but that camp from mid-October until the surrender. So he actually knew literally nothing about the situation in the Philippines, which it would have been nice if he could have known about those too. I mean, just because he's so interested in everything, he could have perhaps helped more.
What problems did the weather present in Japan? You mentioned the snow.
Yes.
There's a lot of snow there.
Right. Japan never got, it got cold enough, but it never got down into the teens that I'm aware of. It would be, about 25 or 26. Our building was an old warehouse. Well, no, it wasn't really old. It was a fairly new one, but it looked old to us. And it was not heated except for the sick room and where the patients were and the medical sergeant's office. Everything else was as is, so when I got home the following year, I never wore anything other than summer clothes, suit coat, and so forth. That changed the following year, however. Australians didn't believe such things as chilblains, and they put their feet right on the burners and so forth, and they wonder why their feet hurt for the rest of their lives. Couldn't convince them. There was an occasional pneumonia, but for the most part, they were strictly deficiency, starvation diseases.
How much did the Japanese provide you with in the way of resources or medicines?
It was minimal. In fact, even toilet paper was minimal. And they don't mean that we wasted it all or whatnot, they just didn't particularly provide it, and there were various ways of improvising. The amount of medicine, well, for example, we had a man that, really unusual for the Australians to have a man they suspected of having rheumatic fever. They don't have it in Australia. It's a strep disease which affects the heart, and rheumatic heart disease is a tough one. And in the old days, it used to result in subacute bacterial endocarditis, which was fatal in another 6 months. And so Sandy said he suspected this fellow had it, and I did too. So he said, what do we do? I said, we give him 120 grains of aspirin every day. So Sandy had to make up a list of 12 Australians on aspirin and change it frequently, so the Japanese never knew, and we knew they wouldn't believe one person should get that amount. And we had him on complete bed rest. He was a good kid, and he knew he had the heart murmur, and he really followed suit. And so several months later, we had a visitor, an American doctor, and so we took him on grand rounds, and we were very proud of this patient. And he examined him. He looked at us and said, you two fakers, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this man's heart. And we said, that's what we think too, but he did have rheumatic heart disease, no matter what you think or say. We're very pleased with your opinion, although we don't like the way you put it. And he lived a normal life. I don't know how much damage we did to him by keeping him essentially immobile, and he did. He just laid there on his back. He moved around enough to not get bed sores and so forth. But we figured it was a question of saving his life, and so we did it that way. And Sandy was very pleased that we were able to do it. But he never told me about the amount of work it involved him and all his paperwork keeping the pills straight.
Kind of curious if there was any difference. I mean, since you were around the Australians, and you were around a lot of other POWs at various times, and Americans. As a group, is there anything, any difference or any peculiarities with the Australians or the way they...
You got ESP. This leads into my best story about them. I was impressed. They were a very military group. They had a good sense of humor. They would kid a lot. They were all sorts. I mean, they talked about big bronze Australians. They had a lot of little short ones too. And they had to work very hard. Many of them were quite sick, but even the ones that were sick, they put them to work in the building making straw rope. And I'm sure they never want to see any straw rope again. And I was impressed and thinking to myself, well, gee, why couldn't Americans, officers and men, behave the way they are and so forth? I thought about it a lot, and I was impressed, no end. There were, I think, 15 or 16 officers and probably 200 or maybe 210 or 15 Australians, some British. Incidentally, these Britishers had been through the Battle of Britain, Dunkirk, Bergen, Norway. They jumped on the destroyers by the wharf to evacuate them and so forth. They ended up in Singapore and then Japan. They'd been in it since the beginning, and they were still going. It just bothered me. I was very proud of them, I said, gee. But one day, they were having a meeting. I was totally unaware of it. They thought I was somewhere else and whatnot. And they were all in Jim Chisholm's quarters, which was actually where we ate our meals and our gathering place, and his bunk was, and so forth. They were all in there, and they were having one hell of an argument. So I waited a minute, and I suddenly opened the door, and I said, "Okay, you guys, you play acted for me for months. You can quit now." And they burst out laughing. They put on this act for me for months. It was unbelievable. And then they reverted back to normal. They were quite a bunch.
Well, that is interesting.
It was really something. And they admitted it. They say, "Yeah, we're trying to impress you."
Of course, everybody, I mean, doesn't matter what country you're from, if you're a prisoner of war, there's still a lot you share in common, and number one is simply the loss of freedom.
Right, that's number one.
Let's see, which one was the last camp you were in?
This one, while there, because I got what we didn't know I had, we called it fever of unknown origin, December of '44, tremendous chills. Lasted about half an hour, 45 minutes, and put me right to bed and so forth. And in 24 hours, I was comfortable, and in 48 hours, I didn't have any fever at all. And because I had been on Bataan and taken the prophylactic quinine and so forth, and never had any symptoms of it, although I had other diseases, we never even thought of malaria. That's why I get it that length of time later. And it bothered the Japanese too. And they took me over to the civilian hospital and did a chest x-ray, and they found I had some bronchiectasis in my right middle lobe of my lung. All right, then, so I was taken to the civilian hospital, and they did the chest x-ray. They found bronchiectasis. This gave them some concern, and it ended up that I was to be sent down to Shinagawa Hospital in Tokyo, which was another event in my travels, much more than a lot of people. And while down there, they worked me over pretty good. They had more facilities, they had more medicines and so forth. Anyway, after I was there about 10 days, they said, "We can't find anything wrong with you except for the bronchiectasis and so forth." So they moved me out of the ward, which was just the Korean coolie sleeping quarters, with no, just the earthen floor that had been worn knobby by bare feet and so on. And a room with some of the doctors, including the ranking naval doctor from Hong Kong. It was a very pleasant experience. And I was to be sent back to Loretz, but March 9th and 10th came along, and if you may remember that date, that was the first real big fire raid in Tokyo. They had 325 B-29s dropping napalm. They burned out 16.5 square miles of Tokyo. The area they hit, 85% was destroyed. And it was 100,000 people were killed in 6 hours. It was the worst military carnage in history. And we weren't too happy. We were on the edge of it. We were not particularly involved, but you didn't know what was going to happen next, of course. It burned for 3.5 days. And eventually, I got back to Loretz, which hadn't changed particularly, but I had always felt secure up there. And the day after I got there, the factories had an air raid. So my safe haven was gone. It wasn't really a safe haven anyway. And things proceeded along in May, in June, and for some reason there was a feeling of optimism, maybe just because we'd gone on that long, I don't know.
Did the treatment toward you change any after the starting the firebombing?
No. One characteristic of them is that when something happens that is so tremendous, whether it's such a simple thing as an American prisoner dropping the microscope, the real bad doctor in Shinagawa who did the human experimentation, when he dropped the microscope, he recited as a prize in medical school. The doctor was away when it happened, and he spent 48 hours expecting he was going to get killed, and the doctor came back. It was such a tremendous blow to the doctor, he just said, "Oh, dismissed." Didn't do a thing. You get paralyzed. And this was sort of, they didn't wreak any havoc on us at all, which I'm aware. Maybe they did at work or whatnot, but not at all. They vaccinated us, and we did it willingly. Of course, we were unaware of all of the experimentations at that time. We don't know whether we ever got anything or not. But the vaccination didn't show anything particular. And then we heard we were going to get some additional prisoners. And I think it was on July 2nd or 1st, we got the whole group from one camp down in Osaka. And that was quite a heterogeneous group of all sorts, including American merchant seamen and Dutch, Japanese, and so on. And incidentally, their camp was destroyed the following night by our bombs. They picked a good time. So we increased from 250, let's say, to about 700. So we were fairly crowded for July and August. Rumors were rife early part of June that it was just about over. And we knew governments were changing and different premiers in and whatnot. And we also knew that we were to be evacuated to Korea, and if not killed before we got there, would be killed after we got there in the event of an invasion and so forth, which was common knowledge, which didn't really affect us very much because it wasn't imminent. You sort of lived in the present. There wasn't any future, so you didn't worry about that very much. And this is the way it went. To back up in terms of news, the preceding year, 43, when Italy surrendered, the Buddhist monk who had accepted all the little ashes of the Australians that died in the camp to be in the temple and so forth, came to the camp, banged on the gates. I wasn't there then, and demanded to be let in, and he was obviously roaring drunk and so forth, having a ball, and every now and then a few words of English about Italy having surrendered and so forth. And the Japs finally threw him out. He was a nuisance, but he achieved his goal. And oh yes, while in Shinagawa, we had up-to-date daily newscasts and so forth. In fact, we had one which detailed the recapture of Cabanatuan in the Philippines. And Colonel Duckworth was recaptured, and he broke his wrist. And we forgot that there was one of the medical corpsmen in Shinagawa that knew Colonel Duckworth very, very well. And he was so overjoyed to hear that the colonel had been rescued that we had to tell him that it was a mistake, because he was going to spill the beans and ruin the radio bit and so on. So we had to tell him this was an error. And actually, the colonel had died, and that put him in the other way, but at least we kept him quiet and so forth. And we were able to see English, Japanese newspapers and so forth. So we were pretty well informed. But when it actually happened, if you want to get to that point now, the workers at times would not go out to work because they rerouted the electricity. So the factories didn't have any, and that would be what they would call dinki yasume. The electricity is on a vacation. Yasume is at ease. It's an all-purpose word for rest. And dinki yasume. Well, this afternoon, everything was as usual. The men fell out, go to work at 3 o'clock, and were told they wouldn't go to work, dinki yasume. And we found that kind of difficult because we could see the factories and they were making the usual smoke and stuff.
That was a big departure from routine.
Right. Yeah, but they wouldn't admit anything and we didn't and so forth. And this was the day before the announcement. And I said, well, we'll have to wait till the men come back from work, because I had contacts who understood Japanese very well and told me that they wouldn't contact me until they really had some news that was worth telling and back up, so I wouldn't know them. It turned out this particular guy I talked to every day, he identified himself at night in the dark, told me all these things, and that was it. And then 2 or 3 days later he says, yeah, I'm the guy. And so when we saw these fellows come back from work, we knew, just from the expression on their faces, that that was it. And The next day at 11 o'clock, all the papers and stuff all say 12. It was 11 o'clock there. The Emperor's recording was on and whatnot. The Japanese all stood at attention in their quarters and so on and so forth. And it was just plain quiet until some carrier planes came over and so forth a few days later. But we felt when we got off the ship preceding end of March, early April, just looking at the people, what are they holding out for? It turns out that the Emperor wanted them to have no gripe at all when they had to surrender because he didn't want a revolution on his hands. That's putting it rather crudely, but this I can document. There's a very excellent book, The Imperial Japanese Conspiracy, by a young man by the name of Bergamini, and who lived in Tokyo. His father was the architect of St. Luke's Hospital in Tokyo. He loved the Japanese in those days when he was a kid. They moved to Nanking. He was there to witness the rape of Nanking. He couldn't understand it. They got to Shanghai. From Shanghai got over to the Philippines and up to Baguio, and they were interned in the Philippines. And while there, he learned enough from books and whatnot to be able to write the Time Life book on mathematics and computers. I've forgotten the exact title. And he was interested enough because of the change in personality of the Japanese he knew, from children-loving, kind people to these SOBs that they actually were. And it's quite a book. It's about 1,800 pages. The historians don't accept it because he's not an historian. But it places the blame squarely and documented squarely on the man who started it and the man who stopped it. And that's the Emperor. And we don't seem to want to give him that credit for some international political reason.
Tell me what it, well, tell me, let's go ahead and tell me about your actual liberation and just describe that and how that felt, because I'm sure you probably still remember how it felt.
Well, it's the only, I think the best description is you remember Hee-Haw and how in some of the years they had 2 or 3 old guys laying on their back, you know, talking about what might or might not happen and so forth. And one of them says, well, we didn't have bad luck, they have no luck at all, and nothing changes, they're just there. That's the way we felt. We physically, we were somewhat excited, but not much. It had taken so long to get to that point that the excitement had worn off before it even happened. And let me think now. It was 15th of August was the actual surrender, or, saying the war has, as they said, the war has entered a ceasing condition. We were told that evening. And they pled with us to keep the Russians out, keep the Red Pack out, and so forth. And they didn't really turn the place over to us, but we didn't let them do their usual things, and so forth. We were able to get out of the camp, walk around. We go to places to, went to one place, they took us to a nice meal, things of that sort. And anyway, nothing particularly happened for maybe 5 or 6 days. And I was in the building, and I heard some planes driving over as though they were strafing. The guys had written on the ground, food, smokes, with lime. And these were carrier planes. They went back to the carrier planes. I didn't know about this. And they'd also dropped a note to clear the parade ground, which I didn't know about. I walk out there. At this point, I still didn't have my glasses. And I looked up, and here was this torpedo bomber coming down over the roof. I mean, just about low enough to knock the Japs that were standing on the roof, because they were enjoying this show, too. I mean, they weren't going to get hurt, they thought. And out opens the bag, the bomb bay doors open, and there are 4 sea bags crammed with stuff. The next thing I know, I'm flying with them right through the wall of the building. Fortunately, it was by a door, and it came off the slides and so on. And I wasn't hurt, but I was chagrined to think that nobody'd stop me from going out there. Everybody else is out of sight. And there were things from the ship stores, newspapers, candy bars, things of this sort. Magazines, newspapers from the ship told us about the atomic bombs days before and so forth, which we'd heard about, but we didn't understand. And then later on, I don't remember just how many days, if many days, word as to how they were going to drop supplies and food from B-29s to us. And they told to mark off places in the rice paddies and so forth, which we did. The Japanese civilians helped us. Our town had been evacuated of everybody for about a week before they surrendered, because our town was due to get it. Actually, the night of surrender, I think. At least it made it dramatic to think that. And so they dropped 2 or 3 loads from B-29s, and they saw all the people from the city running out to these places, so they didn't know any better, so they thought the Japanese were taking all of these things for themselves. They were going out to get them to bring them into us, but they didn't know that. So they decided they better get a little closer, so they tried to drop them in the street next door. They killed 4 or 5 Japanese doing that. One American got a broken leg out of it, and so on. But anyway, it finally all settled down, and we got the stuff in. We saw penicillin for the first time, and medicines of all sorts, and various food supplies. And we knew we couldn't eat very much because our ration had gone from rice to barley. And if you may have noticed, they never served barley on an airplane because it blows up fast. And the Australians cooked it like they did rice, which meant it wasn't cooked in the center. So it really was a gas producer. You could only eat so much. And so a lot of us had a tough time that evening, standing up straight. And so they prepared actually just a meal out of cans and so forth. That pea soup, teaspoon by teaspoon, cold, was wonderful. And the Air Force administrative officer decided, as a result of the fact that they're bringing the stuff in, dropping it close, one sack of shoes, maybe 50 GI boots, pairs of GI boots in a sack, came through the roof of the outhouse and glanced off his head, and he was unconscious. We got him to the civilian hospital after a while, and he stayed there quite a while, and the Air Force administrator said, "Do you think he could stand the trip?" And I said, "I don't think he can stand much of anything." So he prevailed upon the Japanese in our camp to take him over to the big town, name of which I can't remember right now, where the headquarters were of the Japanese secret police, and he got in touch with the Americans at Yokohama. And they agreed to send a plane up to evacuate this fellow, and they were told specifically there would be 3 to be flown out, and that the man was a stretcher case. Well, we'll get to Niigata, which is where they went in a minute or two. Anyway, they made arrangements to add a car to the train, which was packed with people even on the roof, standing on the seats in between and so forth. I was wondering how we were ever going to get on the train, but they broke it in 2 and put a car in the middle, and on in there. The Japanese medical sergeant and the Japanese storekeeper went with us to Niigata, and this lieutenant and myself. And they told us we would be staying at the military hospital. So I told the sergeant we'd had enough of the Japanese military, we'd rather go to the civilian hospital. So they took us to a little private hospital of 6 or 8 beds run by a doctor in his house with 5 lovely little daughters. And we had a lot of the loot from the ship in terms of cocoa and coffee and things of that sort. And so we had an all-night party, and the Jap sergeant, I kept feeding him sake, and he finally went to sleep and so forth. And the storekeeper then saw his opportunity to ask me what I thought was going to happen. And I don't know where I got this wisdom, if that's what it is, but I said to him, you want to know what's going to happen to this fellow? And I said, he'd be hung. And he said, what about me? I said, I heard nothing bad about you. You probably won't even be called as a witness. He was happy about that. He says, what's going to happen to Japan? And I said, the greatest period of prosperity they've ever known. He couldn't believe that. I didn't believe I said it either, but we figured probably we'd do something. And I tried to get the sergeant to, on the way to the airport in the morning, to go to the airport with us, but he took off. I wanted to turn him in, but he knew better. We got along very well. He was quite a character. He was very, very intelligent. He was smart enough to play dumb over in China, so he got assigned to a prison camp in Japan. He was doing all right. And he could really play dumb. And we sort of had fun with puns and so forth. But he was really a bad guy in the early days. He probably still was. So we get to the airport, and here's the sick man. Here's the Air Force lieutenant. We tried to tell the sick man that the war was over, but it didn't penetrate. We were on an old Japanese bus. And down comes a torpedo bomber and a carrier fighter. And they land, and out of the torpedo bomber comes three guys, the pilot, the corpsman, and the doctor. And the doctor was the biggest doctor I've seen. I don't know why they have to send their biggest ones, maybe to... All these guys are interested in doing was seeing the sights of the town. And they were getting kind of rough with our interpreter, so we told them, look, you tell us what you want, we'll tell him, and he'll do it. So they all went into town on a sightseeing trip. And there I was with the sick man and myself, and I went into the bus and laid down and went to sleep. Of course, the Americans woke me up when they came back, and they gave me hell for going to sleep. And I said, so what could I do? They decided they wanted to do something anyway. And they agreed on that. They were quite kind. They gave us each $20. They said we could use it on our way home, and gave us the address so we could send it back when we got home. And flew him out. That was the last we saw of him. So we stayed with the interpreter who brought us to the camp, and he fed us a fantastic meal. I'm sure they never had one like this in the camp, the other prisoners. And we went to the railway station and boarded the train at 9 o'clock to go to Yokohama. And it took us from 9 o'clock till 10 o'clock the next morning to get there. And meanwhile, seats like the old train cars here, the two veterans, officers from the South, sitting across from us. So we decided we were going to stuff ourselves with our food, so forth. And they were laughing and joking. We didn't really understand what they were doing. They literally ignored us, and that was all right. But we did tell the people, the train men tell the people in the car to behave. They had two Americans there, and they should, act like gentlemen rather than their normal selves, things like that. And so eventually we got to Yokohama, and the Japanese civilian who started on the train with us disappeared. He was our mentor, I guess. And in fact, everybody had disappeared, and we were in the American part. And that was that. And we decided we didn't want to turn ourselves in right off. Let's see if we can get on the Cowpens, which was the carrier these guys were from. You think communications had fouled up around here? We got nowhere. So by 4 or 5 in the afternoon, we finally turned ourselves in. And
Did you leave from Yokohama? That's where
we left. We were taken by bus to Yokosuka Naval Base and flown from there to Okinawa. And got there about 4 in the morning. There wasn't a bed left in the place or whatnot, so I slept on a pile of rocks for a couple of hours. We watched things happening, and then they sort of got us oriented. We were to go out that afternoon, and we also heard that every now and then one of these planes that they'd been using crashed, and learned that the one we actually got on, learned this later, had 1,200 hours without any major maintenance. And on the flight, we were treated very well, had a nice sightseeing tour of the island, even saw the 75 millimeter gun, which had accepted a Japanese projectile and exploded in the middle of the barrel, things of that sort, and got a pretty good notion of how the things went. And so off we go, maybe 8 o'clock in the morning to Okinawa, to Clark Field. And The C, not a C, a B-25. And most of the people were in the back area of it with the big window there. And the British doctor was listening on his headphones, and there were 3 on the side on planks. They used to be just plywood when they didn't last and ejected people. They were real planks. But with the bomb bay doors going like this, and wrapped up in blankets, so it was kind of cold, and we could see out, and over there was a typhoon. It seemed about that close. It was a long trip, and I noticed the British officer, he was in a book by Emily Hand as a society doctor in Hong Kong. He's quite a character. Anyway, his face changed expression. And after a while, it changed expression again. And he took the headset off and put it down, didn't listen anymore. So after we got to Clark Field, I asked him, he said, well, 2 of these planes in this flight went down, no survivors. So he said I couldn't quite listen to anymore of it. The aftermath of that was that I was with the Vermont National Guard in their summer camp in Vermont, and I found, or an Air Force man found me that was a pilot in that flight, and wanted to know the details of what I knew about the 2 planes going down. So I assured him that, as far as we were concerned, we had adequate briefing. But on these planes, maybe no one understood English. Or a whole variety of things. Maybe they were all half sick or so forth. That was it. He said he felt better after talking about that, because he was afraid that they just loaded people on and went, but they hadn't. They took good care of them.
So you were ever so slowly making your way back to the States?
Yeah. We eventually... Well, one time I had the most realistic dream I ever had. It was, for some reason, I was in Paris, in their most luxurious hotel. And this was way back in the early days, after we were prisoners. A great room. Fantastic. No furniture, no bed, no nothing. Slept on the floor. We were doing.
Where did you arrive back in the States at?
Well, back to San Francisco. We got to Philippines. We were there maybe 2 or 2.5 weeks, and did a little touring around. Saw the walled city, which unfortunately was completely demolished. Yamashita never intended all of this. His orders were you pull out, and Navy guys came in, 20,000 of them got themselves all killed, but they killed 100,000 Filipinos. Just a rampage. Terrible. That was one of the reasons Yamashita got hung, because it was under his command, even though he couldn't stop it, he tried to. I sort of liked the guy. He was a real soldier. I like Yamamoto too, the Navy person. From what I knew about them, I never met them. So we had an option of flying back to the States or going by ship, and I thought it wasn't good to have too rapid a re-entry, so I went by ship, figuring it would take about 3 weeks, and it didn't take anywhere nearly that long. On the way over, we stopped at Hawaii and Guam, and then the Philippines. Going back, we never saw land once we left the Philippines. The new Admiral class transports, they were to be passenger ships. And plenty of fresh water and so forth. Very well. And I'd left San Francisco on October 4th, 1941, arrived there on October 3rd, 1945. And we were met by, I think it was General Summerall, and just walked down the plank with duffel bags and into buses and into Lovell General Hospital in San Francisco, where we remained for a week or 10 days, opted to fly back the rest of the way, called home, and I was told by the operator that there was a military emergency on. They couldn't place the call right then, and I said, I'm a returned prisoner of war. She said, that's a military emergency, and I was talking to my wife in 2 minutes. And the operator, and these were before the days of the computers, the operator was a gal I knew, had known all my life, recognized my voice.
Wow.
And that was the beginning back. And then we flew back by stages in a DC-3, Hospital 1 litter patient, and the rest technically were all patients. From San Francisco to Ogden, Utah, to Ames, Iowa. These may be all mixed up. It seems to me we were in Omaha too, so that could have been Ames and Omaha. Anyway, on Sunday morning we stopped for a short time at O'Hare. Or no, not O'Hare, Midway. There wasn't any O'Hare at that point. And for maybe an hour or two, and we boarded again, and we were taking off, and I smelled gasoline, which they used in those days. I looked out the window, and there the gasoline was streaming off the wing. So I raised my hand up, and the nurse was in the back, and just raised it up, and she came forward right off, looked out, and went forward. And it was still streaming out the wing, of course. They had to put the cap back on. And we landed amidst the Chicago Fire Department. And I just thought it was ironic. We might get home and be 500 feet off the ground and no survivors, which is, would have been what would have happened. And we put the cap on and continued on to Fort Devens, Massachusetts. And then got home in 2 or 3 days.
How much, if any, did you talk about your experience once you got home?
I don't really know for sure. People were hesitant to ask me, it seemed. Although my wife Claire would listen, of course, when I talked. I don't think I talked very much. I was more interested in finding out what had happened there. And quite a bit had. I don't think I really got talking about it until the last 15 years. And I think in a way that was kind of too bad. But many things have happened to me in the last 6 or 7 years, or maybe 4 or 5 years, that would have been better for me had they happened 50 years ago than just now. But my whole life has been changed around. I'm a much happier person than I ever was. Not that I ever felt I was unhappy, but I just wasn't as happy as I thought I could be.
Well, how do you think your prisoner of war experience affected your life?
Well, it affected one way in one particular incident, and I think you could understand why. I was asked this question in front of my wife, and of course she expected me to say getting married to her. And this other thing was a little more overpowering. There's no question this is the outstanding event of all our lives. It's hard to describe because nothing like that has ever happened to you. You don't know what's going to happen again. What? You don't know if you're going to be hurt. You do hope if you get killed, you get killed quickly and not over a period of 2 or 3 years of illness and so forth. Father Cummings, whom I got to know very well, and you may have heard of, the Marinaller who coined the phrase, "There are no atheists in foxholes." And he died on one of the ships going to Japan. I knew him very well after the surrender. He was a civilian at one of the places in Manila and joined the Army at Christmas time and was on Bataan, where I ended up on the 8th of April at that hospital. Got to know him very well. And he was quite a guy, but and he had more faith than most people. But you had to have your doubts now and then. You had to feel you had to be lucky, and also you could tell about people that would have a premonition. And I can remember hearing about a man from, I think it was Nebraska, an officer. He was with the group that first came over, and this is on the 2nd or 3rd night in Bataan. He was talking to people about his childhood and so forth. The group broke up, and a shell just fell on him. He literally wasn't there anymore. He didn't live until morning, and he just plain disappeared in pieces. And he knew, and you could tell from the way he was talking, he wasn't going to make it. I don't think he knew it was going to be that soon. Or some people are just plain pessimistic. I had an experience which may or may not be appropriate, but I remember back in February of 1939, I was a third-year medical student. I was with the girl I married and her sister who was visiting the man that she married. And the question came up, what would happen to Glenn and myself in the event of a war? And during the course of time that it took to come to the answers, and I knew Glenn would be 4F because he'd had a broken neck in a car accident and so forth, and I knew I had medical ROTC. in that short time, this is what passed through my mind. I was on the fantail of a ship. I was looking at a coastline in the background, which I knew was Asia. I'd been there 4 years, and I'd been through a war. And that was it. And I didn't remember that until December of 43. It was a comfort after that. I didn't know whether to believe it or not. And that's the only such experience I've ever had. But I think about that, and that was better than thinking about dying in a submarine or something. And that was a help. And the chaplains were good, and I did a lot of praying, of course.
Well,
I guess other people must have too. I don't think mine was
definitely
enough.
so. That part is not unique.
Right.
Well, our time's up here. If you have any closing comments you want to make, please feel free to do so.
I hadn't,
We could
for hours and hours and hours,
as you
yes.
well know.
And then there would get to be a lot of and so forth. This is good. It shouldn't be any longer because people can't listen
But
attentively any longer. In fact, maybe this is the limit.
like
I think that perhaps the thoughts that came to my mind last Saturday when several of us attended the commissioning of a new ship, an LHD-5 called the USS Bataan. There was a Bataan during World War II, and afterwards it was a converted ship into an aircraft carrier. It was a CLV Bataan. And there was an Australian warship, the HMAS Bataan, that fought along with the other Bataan off Korea. And there were 11 Australians there that were on that ship as crew when the commissioning was done down in Mississippi last Saturday. There was much talk about heroes and all this and that. And for some reason, we survived to tell you about the heroes. They didn't come back. Okay.